Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to our podcast on Edward I, King of England. Once again, our source for this podcast is A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Four Kingdoms of Britain by Mark Morris. And right here we're going to pick up where we left off, starting in 1262 with Edward's return to England. And this is after Edward was defeated when he tried to seize power the previous year and went out to fight tournaments in France. Now, in his absence over the past several months, war with Wales broke out yet again. Llewellyn ap Griffith was in rebellion, and he was trying to seize all the marshlands and gain complete control of them and give Wales independence from England. Now, during these wars, Roger Clifford and Roger Leyburn, both both lords who had their castles taken away from them after Edward had given them to them, were becoming increasingly hostile against Eleanor, who was a foreign queen of England, and against Henry III, who had not allowed them to keep the land given to them granted to them by his son. So after this absent period where Edward is fighting tournaments, he returns back to England, and with the war happening against Wales, Roger Clifford and Roger Leyburn are both excited for the return of Edward, hoping that he'll put them to good use and go and fight Wales and regain castles there for them. However, to their disappointment, Edward is extremely happy with his French knights, a small mercenary army that he returns with. And this outrages the people in England, both the barons and Clifford and Leyburn, who were both once loyal to Edward. However, it does not anger them to the point where they wish to see Edward dead. They merely wish to be restored in Edward's sight, the same status that they had before. So, with problems like this persisting, the barons, led by Roger Clifford and Roger Leyburn, both demand the king get rid of all foreigners. They want them all out. And on April 25th, Simon de Montfort returns to England, and he's chosen to lead the people to demand the king to rid the land of all foreigners permanently. So in May, they gather at Oxford for their parliament to be held. Simon and his men renew their vows to uphold the provisions of Oxford at all costs. And they demand that the king, Henry, denounce all people who refuse the same thing as enemies to the throne and the mortal enemies of England. Henry refused to do this, and when he refused, Simon ordered Clifford and Leyburn to attack the queen's lands. Eleanor's lands begin to get burned, cattle were seized, and slaughtered. And the reason why this happened is because in medieval England, or in the medieval period, battles were not something that people sought to fight. Richard the Lionheart, who's extremely famous for being fearless and brave and bold during the Crusades, probably fought about 3 battles in his lifetime. Sieges were more common than battles, and raids were more common than both, usually, in the medieval period. In England at this point in 1262, a battle had not been fought in almost 100 years. So it was a raid, it was scavenging, it was not small fights. There were armies could be assembled, but the idea still was not for those armies to meet on one plot of land and go toe to toe with each other and see who could win. The reason why battles were not something that people sought to fight in the medieval period was because you could quickly lose all the power you gained. You see, you had lords, barons, knights of high standard. You had usually the royal family on the battlefield. If you did lose a battle, according to the rules of chivalry, you still were supposed to capture lords. You were not supposed to kill them or execute them. You could capture them and you could ransom them back to their family for castle, for money, or for a large plot of land, some form of wealth. But you still were not supposed to kill them, even if you did fight a battle with them and capture them. And that was how the code of chivalry was accepted in this period. Now, when his mother's lands are being attacked, Edward goes ahead and he abandons his when he first returned to England, he went to Wales to try to seize his castles back, as I stated earlier. He abandons that and rushes back home to try to save his mother. In a few days, he arrives in London and meets his father. And they're bound in the tower. They're hiding inside the Tower of London. But the Tower of London is not well stocked. There isn't a lot of food. There's not a lot of water. There's no money. There are no troops commanded by the king and the queen. Edward's the only one who has a force with him. It's a small force of French knights that he brought back with him from his tournaments in France. So he's the only one who's able to offer military resistance to Simon de Montfort. And at this point, the royal family is outnumbered. Eventually, Simon de Montfort writes a letter to the governor of London, because the king doesn't even have the entire town on his side at this point. He merely has the Tower of London. So Simon de Montfort writes a letter to the governors of London and says, "Hey, are you for the provisions of Oxford, or are you against them?" They decide they're for the provisions of Oxford, and they send a letter to the king in the Tower saying, "Hey, Simon outnumbers us. Your son is the only one with any force to resist them. But, well, sorry, I need to correct myself. Your son has a force that can resist them, but that's a foreign force." So the governors of London demand Henry III agree to the terms with Simon de Montfort and tell your son to disband his army of mercenaries and send them away. We don't want those foreigners here in the first place. So get rid of them. We're with Simon on that. In the desperate situation, June 29th, Edward, before his father can answer yes to Simon de Montfort, rides to New Temple, which is east of the city. Now, this temple belonged to the famous order of Crusaders called the Knights Templar, and I'll put a link in the description for Real Crusades History's video on the Knights Templar if you want to learn about what they were and how you became a member of the Templar and what they dressed as, what armor they had, what weapons they used. That'll all be covered in that video. But there's a lot of treasure in this building. And Edward goes to the building, which is locked, with a few of his French knights and says, "Oh, I just want to see my mother's jewels." So they allow him inside, and once he's inside, they take iron hammers, they smash the chests open, and they seize 1,000 pounds worth of loot, and they flee. And when they flee outside the castle, and they head to Windsor Castle. And from there, they hope to be able to resist Simon de Montfort. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to draw Simon away from London and draw him to Windsor where they could fight him on their terms. Simon, however, is a good old experienced general. He's been on Crusade before. He fought against the King of France. He fought in Gascony, which is also part of France. So he doesn't fall for it. He bypasses Windsor and moves on to Kent. He lays siege to Kent. And he captures all the ports there except for the Dover port, which Garrison held out against his men. So it looked like Edward is gaining momentum. He's gathering an army around him to resist Simon de Montfort and resist the people who want to destroy the monarchy of England. But for the entire royal family, the situation is not going well. After Edward went to that church and seized it, it was the people were astonished by his actions. They considered it, evil. Excuse me. For him to use deceit, deception, and treachery to steal wealth, basically. It wasn't his, so it was stealing. And within hours of his departure, within hours of him fleeing London, they go on a rampage and they start to seize royalist property. They start to steal royalist food. Riots break out. And so Henry III finally completely gives up and accepts all the terms of Simon de Montfort. Eleanor, however, was extremely strong and courageous woman. She's pretty much made of sterner stuff than Henry is, and she wants to flee the city and go and join her son to resist Simon de Montfort. So on July 13th, she set out in the river of Windsor and wanted to, not Windsor, she set out in a boat and wanted to ride upstream the Thames River, and which led to Windsor, and she hoped to join her son there. However, the townspeople found out that she was going to try and flee, so a mob, an angry mob gathered on London Bridge, and as her boat's approaching, they begin to pelt eggs, and they pelt stones at her. So when she realizes she's in danger, she abandons it, and she runs and hides, and she hides in the palace of the Bishop of London, and he gives her sanctuary there. So, with all this happening, and Simon de Montfort's army arrives 2 days later inside of London after Eleanor was attacked, and Henry III completely surrenders and says, "You know what, I give up, I'll accept your terms," and he tells the Dover garrison, which I mentioned earlier had held out against Simon de Montfort, to surrender King's orders, give up Simon's won. And after this, on July 24th, Simon begins to march to Kent Castle to take down Edward I, because now he's solidified everything. All the ports are his. Sorry, not in Kent. To go to Windsor. All the ports are his there. He's going to go and lay siege to Windsor, where Edward is hiding. So he begins to march there on July 24th, and before he even arrives, Edward receives word from his father, "Hey son, it's over, give up, Simon's won." So he has to return to his family by himself. His foreign mercenary army, they have to leave. They are banished from England, and they all have to vow never to return. So with the knight's departure, it seems like the family is completely crushed. However, at the end of all this, Louis, the Ninth of France, calls for a meeting between Henry and his nobles and Simon and his nobles. And when they all call him to the court, Henry III expects King Louis to agree with him because he's the monarch, he's the noble, he's the monarch here, not the noble. They are all nobles, but he's the monarch. And in actuality, the King Louis agrees with Simon de Montfort and says, "Nope, you made those vows in July, when you surrendered to agree to everything Simon says," and he demands that he uphold them. So Simon feels like he's really won a victory. So in England, he begins to appoint his friends into higher office and higher status, and appoint his men in place in the Parliament. But the people, Simon's support begins to crumble very quickly. And the reason why is because a lot of the havoc that's been going on the last months in England is all Simon's fault. He was the one who ordered his men to attack Eleanor's lands. He's the one responsible for, even though the people were angry at Edward for sneaking into the Knights Templar's temple, the temple, and stealing the money, they still blame Simon for all the bad that's happened, because in no way it's his fault. He's the one who initiated the action. And because of this, the Bishop of Westminster excommunicates all involved in the riots and the raids that happened within the past few months. And the reason that he excommunicates all of them, including Simon de Montfort, who was selected as the ringleader for all these raids that happened, is because they all blame Simon for what happened. It was Simon who sent his men in the first place to go and attack Eleanor's lands in England, even though they're still very angry at Edward for stealing the money and bringing in foreign troops. They still blame Simon for all the havoc that's been wreaked, because he was the one who initiated it, so he's left holding the bag. And in August 18th, Roger Clifford and Roger Leyburn, both men who appointed Simon de Montfort as the leader to go and demand the king get rid of the foreigners, make a secret pact with Edward to be his friends in all of his affairs. And the reason why is because they didn't really care about the provisions of Oxford, they didn't care about replacing the monarchy. All they cared about was actually being on good terms with the royalists. They wanted Edward to hold them in a higher esteem than he did these foreign mercenaries who he had gathered around him. So now, rather than building an alliance with people, Simon de Montfort is now, his allies are trying to disappear. So after all this, in mid-October, another parliament was called for all the nobles and all the barons to come to, just as they done before, so they can appoint their ministers and start making their new laws. Edward asked permission to leave this parliament because he said that he wanted to go see his wife, which was really a ruse. What he did was he left and went to Windsor, the same castle that he was in as Simon came to capture him. He went there, and the following day, Henry III arrived, and Roger Clifford and Roger Leyburn were both there waiting for Edward to arrive. When he arrived, most of the nobles and all the magnates that had been gathered at the Parliament in Westminster fled and rejoined the king, because they said, you know what, we don't like Simon anymore, we're going to join the king's side. And so they all joined with the king, and they started to march. They began to march against Simon with the intent to arrest him and punish him for what he'd been doing. So Simon sees in a dire situation. He's outnumbered this time. He's basically the same situation the royal family was in a few months before. So Simon de Montfort sends an appeal to King Louis of France, telling him, hey, you said that the royal family should keep the vows they made, so are you going to let this chaos that's now is running through England affect me? And unfortunately for Simon, his appeal to the King Louis falls on deaf ears. And the reason why is because between the time that Louis called for Henry III and Simon de Montfort to come to France and settle their differences, Eleanor, Henry's wife, had been speaking to the king, and she had told him about her being attacked in London, about the arrogant actions of Simon de Montfort towards her and towards the royal family, and how this war is all his fault. So the only fit person to maintain order is the king. And with that, Louis tells him, nope, the king should be able to rule without the shackles of his people holding him back, just as they did in the days of old. And the decision was so-called Mise of Amiens. Forgive me from spelling it. If I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'll leave the spelling down here. And after that, Simon feels that he has no other choice but for all-out war. And the posting of this ultimatum by Louis opens the eyes of those who have a complete desire to see change in the government, and Simon becomes their beacon, their person of hope to lead them in freedom against the king. So both Simon and the king begin to gather armies around themselves, and this eventually leads up to the Battle of Lewes. And again, as I stated before, that in the medieval period, open battle was not something that people were eager to have happen. The reason why is because there was a huge risk. You had nobles on the battlefield who could die, and you could end your dynasty on the spot. You had noble families who could be wiped out, dukes, earls. Many of the major parts of government would be on the field of battle. And even if you were to win an outright battle according to the rules of chivalry during the medieval period, you should capture the nobles and ransom them back to their families. This was a win-win situation for you. You had taught them a lesson, you had beaten them in battle, and when you ransomed them back to the family, they had to pay you for their freedom. And yet again, if you got captured yourself, you didn't want execution to be the nearest thing. So the battlefield has certainly changed a lot since, in the days of Rome, when you defeat somebody, it's total submission or death. Vercingetorix, who was king of the Gauls, when he was captured by Julius Caesar, wound up being executed as a public spectacle. So things had changed for sure. And so, by December, full civil war is broken out between Simon de Montfort and the Montfortians, as they were called, and Edward, Henry, and the Royalists. Richard of Cornwall was by Edward's side throughout all this, who was his brother-in-law and also Edward's uncle. And so before the Battle of Lewes actually took place, there were indeed letters back and forth between the two parties. Simon was outnumbered 2-1. The king had roughly 10,000 men. Simon had about 5,000. And this, of course, puts him in a very bad position. So letters were sent back and forth saying, is there a peaceful term we can find? Henry was somewhat more open to peace. Edward and his uncle Richard were eager to have the Montfortians punished. They told him, there's even accounts that said Edward sent letters saying, you're welcome to come and surrender. Excuse me. You're welcome to come and surrender if you come in with ropes around your neck so we can hang you as soon as you surrender. So a peaceful solution was not something that they were eager for. So Montfort, however, was very eager for a battle, actually. He did not want this to be a drug-out fight. And the reason why is because, remember, Montfort and Henry go back several years, including a time when they were in France, where they were fighting, and Henry actually fled and abandoned his men and ran and hid in a church. And Simon de Montfort walked in and told him, you may be king of England, but they should have you locked up like Charles the Simple. Charles the Simple was a military commander, was the king of France, who was such a terrible military commander that his own people had him, forced him to abdicate the throne and had him locked up. And so Simon knows that Henry is not a good commander. Know your enemy, know yourself, and 100 battles you'll never be in danger of defeat. So he wants to force Henry to fight him face to face. And when they eventually do meet, Simon sets himself up with a hill to his backside as well as castle. Henry places Edward on his right flank, Richard on his left flank, and himself in the center. When both sides draw up, Edward leads the cavalry forward and crashes into Simon's left flank. And he's just slaughtering these people. Most of them were, a lot of them were peasantry and inexperienced footmen. And he's, having a time. He's just obliterating them. He's been fighting tournaments since he was 17 years old. This is very easy for him. And they eventually flee. They flee the battlefield. And this is where Edward makes a great mistake. He chases and pursues them off the field. And it looks like he's crushing the enemy, but what he's actually doing is he's exposed Henry's right flank of infantry with no defense against Simon. Simon then moves forward in good order and just crushes both Richard of Cornwall and Henry III on the field of battle. Richard of Cornwall flees and hides in a nearby windmill, and Henry III retreats to the priory and just binds himself up on the inside. So Edward's slaughtering the enemy, and by the time he turns around to regroup his cavalry and look at the enemy, he sees that Simon's army is the one standing on the field. His father's either dead or have fled the field. They've broken formation and they've scattered. So at the moment, it seems like Simon has complete control, but it's not a decisive victory. The best troops, which are Edward's, are still ready for a fight. Both the king, Henry, and Richard have fortified themselves inside of buildings, and sieges can last a very long time. So rather than trying to drag this out and storm the castle, Simon chooses for diplomacy. And there were a couple reasons for this. One, like I said, a siege could last a long time. The political ability of it. It would sound much better if I won the Battle of Lewes as opposed to the war was won with the Siege of Lewes. It's psychological, because in a period where battles were not a big thing, you were a very top dog if you defeated the enemy in a battle where they outnumbered you 2-1. And then also, he didn't want to storm a holy place and slaughter people on the inside, because remember, earlier this year, Edward did the very same thing when he broke into the Knights Templars temple and stole the treasure out. So it was bad PR for Simon if he was to do this. So he gives the terms to the king. The first term are, we're going to restate the provisions of Oxford. It's time you got to abide by them. And Henry of Amiens, who was Richard of Cornwall's eldest son, and Edward are going to be Simon's hostages until for however long he decides. He did not give them a definitive date. They would just be hostages. So Henry III is allowed to remain king in name only, and he's placed in London. He's not necessarily under house arrest. He is watched by Simon's barons and Simon's men, but Edward has to go wherever Simon demands he goes. He spends a short time in Dover with Henry, and then he's eventually moved to Wallingford Castle in Berkshire. And then eventually some people start telling Simon, hey, Edward's still going to be the king at one point, and he's a lot stronger, a lot more hot-headed, and much more of a man of action than his father. So they begin to argue that perhaps you should release Edward from captivity. Still keep under a close watch, but he's actually a captive. Don't make him a hostage. Give him house arrest, basically, like his father has. And so Simon agrees to allow him to do so, but Edward has to give up all of his lands that were granted to him by his father, including Gascony, all the lands he has in England. He has to give his sons to Simon as hostages in exchange for his freedom. And if he ever does anything to try and change the political structure of England from this point on, he will be disinherited from the crown and lose his standing as prince, basically. He won't be able to legally take the crown. So Edward agrees, and he's released. Now, he's released, again, quote unquote, because he's still closely watched. He hasn't gained any more freedom in his release than he had when he was in captivity in the first place. And again, he's still very closely watched. by Simon and his men. And so after this was in on the year, this was 1265, by the way, March 11th of 1265, when Edward was released. And it was done in a fancy ceremony at Westminster Hall, as a sign of good for the people. However, Simon was very blind to the fact that there were still several people who did not want him in power. Remember, he was basically the scapegoat for both Louis and all the barons who were his allies when Louis put down the law and said, hey, we have to blame somebody for the raids and fights earlier this summer of 1264. He was the one who was blamed for it. And even though the barons did indeed not want the king in charge, they didn't necessarily want Simon to replace them. So right after he seems to gain complete control of the country, there was already a new plot to release the king and restore him to the throne. So Edward was allowed in the last bit of May to receive visitors, and he was even given the freedom to ride about with the visitors. So on May 28th, he began to race with his men, and this is a famous stint in Edward's life. What he did was he told the men who were guarding him, let's find out which horse is the fastest, and they would swap horses back and forth. And when Edward gets the quickest horse, he just gallops off away from his enemy, and he's credited with saying, "Loadings, I bid you good day," and just taking off. And so as soon as he flees, he immediately begins to gather allies around him. Roger Leybourne and Roger Clifford, they rush back to his side and say, hey, we're going to help you fight this out. And several other barons and other lords who had pledged loyalty to Simon de Montfort begin to pledge their loyalty to Edward and agree to help reinstate him to his kingship. Simon calls for his son, Simon the Younger, to come and rescue him. And the reason why is because Edward's barons that came to join him already outnumbered Simon's standing army that he had. He was again outnumbered by the royalists. So he figured if his son was to join him, he'd be able to cut the forces of... He'd be able to, not cut the forces in half, but match the forces that Edward was rallying against him. So Edward begins to capture castles and march further north to retaliate against Simon, because people flocked to him extremely quickly. It wasn't a long period. Within a few months, he already had an army of anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 men. By August, Edward has arrived at Kenilworth, which was the great fortress where Simon the Younger was hiding. However, he had failed to put good men, well, not good men, failed to put guards on his walls. And he figured that Edward was still days away, so I have time to prepare for battle. However, the royalists, when they arrived, realized that there are no guards up on this castle. So they immediately rushed in with the cavalry force and slaughter Simon the Younger's army. They did, again, this was a much more of an aggressive term towards war. They weren't out to capture knights or capture nobles. They were out to win. So they slaughtered Simon's forces. Simon himself, the Younger, had to leap out of his bed with nothing on and row stark naked across the river to save himself. And so by August 2nd, Edward has now defeated half of Simon de Montfort's entire force, beaten his son in open battle, and captured several of his knights, as well as killed many of the enemy. So Edward comes up with a very cunning plan to make the victory more guaranteed. They have all these captured banners and all these captured coat of arms from Simon de Montfort's men. Simon is not positive that Simon de Montfort is not positive his son Simon the Younger has been defeated by Edward yet. So Edward dresses his men up as Simon's and begins to march towards him near Evesham. And so they rest the night of August. Simon de Montfort rests the night of August 2nd, expecting his son to come and join him the following morning. And when he wakes up in the morning, he sees Edward's army marching forward, waving his son's banners and wearing his son's coat of arms, and he's excited. But as they approach closer and closer, they realize that's not Simon's army. That's Edward's army coming near them. And that they've not only been outwitted, they've been outmaneuvered. And Simon's men eventually begin to break down. They've lost morale. One of them is credited saying, "We are all dead men, for it is not your son as you believed." So they begin to march forward directly towards Simon. And Montfort's chances at the Battle of Evesham, they were terrible. The element of surprise, the command of the high ground, both which he had used the Battle of Lewes, were now being used against him by Edward. Edward had superior numbers. He was close to the enemy. He knew the size of the enemy. And Simon was not expecting Edward to be there. He was expecting his son to join him. And now he's faced to fight the enemy. The battle is a complete and utter rout. And one of the things that makes this battle stand out in history against several others is the way in which it ends. As I stated before, in the medieval period, people expected you to capture nobles. Simon was expected to be captured by most people, and you would ransom him back to his wife or to other barons. Sorry, not to the barons, to other family members. That's not what happened. Edward had ordered a specific hit squad of 12 knights to find and kill Simon de Montfort on the battlefield. And another interesting fact during this battle, Simon still had Henry III, the king, captured, and he dressed him up as one of his own men. The hit squad that was sent to kill Simon actually came across Henry, who had been wounded in the middle of the battle, and he started screaming, no, stop, don't kill me, I'm the king, it's me. They realize who he is. They find Simon, who is already injured in the neck by a lance, and they cut him to pieces. They rip off his armor, mutilate his body, tear him up. They slice off his genitals and hang him over his head. Some accounts say they stuff him in his mouth. It was very brutal. And then they send that head to Roger Mortimer, one of Simon's enemy's wife, as a gift. And this is Edward shining as the lion. You know, his father had failed to defeat Simon at the Battle of Lewes earlier. His father had failed to protect his wife, Eleanor, when they were besieged in London. He didn't have the strength to build an army to save himself. He wasn't even able to diplomatically defeat Simon the first time they appealed to, the first time Henry called him forth, he said, nope, you got to keep the promises you made when you were captured in London. And the second time, he didn't even defeat Simon diplomatically. It was Eleanor who convinced Louis to allow Henry to remain king. And after he's captured, it's his son Edward who escapes captivity. It's his son Edward who wins the Battle of Evesham. It's his son Edward who defeats Simon de Montfort on the field of battle, and who also saves Henry III's life, where he could have easily been killed. And so this transformation has shown the transformation of a young boy to a man is now full. It's completely come forth. Edward is clearly worthy of the crown, more so than his father, who's currently alive. And he's proven to be a great leader, a great tactician, strong diplomatically, to gather all the barons around him to fight. His position did have a lot to do with that. The fact that he was prince, that he was going to be the next king, was certainly certainly a good reason as to why the barons pledged themselves to him, because they knew he's going to be the next king. If we're on his good side, that's going to help us in the future. If we're on his bad side, it's going to make things more complicated, even if he's not in charge. And Edward's not the kind of man to be king in name only. Edward's going to rule as a king with an iron fist. So that concludes our podcast for Edward. Here, the Battle of Lewes, the Battle of Evesham. And next time, we're going to continue on where Edward leads a crusade into the Holy Land.